All right, welcome back to the Fight Mind series, episode 5. Well, we'll call it like 5.5 because we did do a little Q&A for 4. This week, our topic will be, improvements, assessing improvements in fighters, gauging how it is that guys get better, how, what we like to look for to really determine whether or not someone's actually improving or if it's kind of just surface level. As well as we'll do a little bit at the end talking about, the opposite end of that spectrum when guys start to decline and how they kind of identify that. Ghost, how we doing, my man?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to discuss this topic because the idea of improvement is often thrown around way too much.
Yeah, another one that's like often misrepresented and often, packaged up as something that it's not. So I think that's kind of our meat and potatoes here. What we're trying to get at is a lot of these misunderstood topics and try and boil them down to the way that you and I perceive them.
Yeah, and I think this will be good because I don't think there's ever been a podcast about just improvement because it's usually integrated within like when people are covering cards, right? It's not something that it's overly discussed.
Yeah, it's something that, you'll see in like more matchup specific kind of discussions rather than like this holistic kind of approach of, everything as a whole. And I think there's a lot that we can dive into with it. But so how do we define improvement? I'll ask you first. Your own question.
So for me, it's when a fighter develops new skills and whether they can change from fight to fight. Very simplistic definition for me, but developing new skills and whether they've added stuff. What about you?
Yeah, so I define improvement. So I kind of compartmentalize it into two specific subsets. So I look at, because improvement as an idea is pretty easily grasped, right? It's just getting better at something in some way. Very nebulous, but, I break it down in two distinct ways. Are you improving something that you are already good at, or are you improving something that you're weaker at? And the way that, the reason I like to look at it that way is because I think one of those is actually a little bit harder than the other. One is a more difficult choice to make, I think, but I think, in trying to work on what you're already good at and improve that, that's when you're getting those like even tinier, more incremental gains rather than, if you're a guy, Josh Van is an example, who has never wrestled before in your life, it's going to be hard work, working on your wrestling and all that, but, you're going to make massive leaps in relatively short periods. So the way, to answer the bones of the question is just, I like to look at what approach guys are taking to grow beyond their current limitations.
Right, and I think that's good that you have two different ways of gauging it because like you said, is the guy getting better at what they're already good at, or are they changing their style specifically, right? Because like you said, I think changing the style specifically to like match an opponent, I think that's one of the hardest things to do because you're ultimately going to revert back to what you're good at when you're in the heat of battle, when the bullets start flying, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really not something that you can kind of adjust for. Like when the pressure is on, when you're in these more uncomfortable positions, like should you be hurt? Should you be getting pressure there? Something's coming back at you that, you're not comfortable with. You're going to revert to your, as Jabs calls them, core competencies, the things that you've, spent your entire career working on and sort of like finally dialed into what it is that you do and what it is that you like. So, that in and of itself is what I view as a kind of limiter, right? If you're stuck in just these like core parameters of what it is that you've always been good at, what it is that got you there in the first place, that's good. Don't lose sight of that. But, that's the kind of thing that presents opportunities for people who are doing tape study, who have seen the way that you fight, who know how to take advantage of that, right?
Exactly. And to build on that, I think this is something that's unique in MMA in that, like you said, there's guys that are already good at that, right? But there are also guys that can change their style completely and add weight and add new things. And those are the types of fighters that I get really excited about. And because a fighter can come in with a style and by the end of their career, they've added so many things that they become a completely different fighter by the end of their career. So, yeah, I think that's something that's, for me at least, I rate that higher than the guy that's just been doing their own thing from day one, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree.
I do agree. It's like on one hand, that can be incredibly impressive. You have a guy who has, this relatively narrow skill set, and they've dialed it into such a high level that they can really, they don't need to deviate from that. But, as impressive as that is, I think it's infinitely more impressive to have a guy, like an example right off the top of the head is Jose Aldo, who comes in with, one style, and now you look at Jose Aldo's early fights, he's like, just pure kind of Muay Thai stylist with like a little bit of grappling. And now you look at him and he's almost like this fundamental textbook boxer. So it's like, that's a massive shift over a very long career. And to still be like, incorporating the things that he is from each different kind of discipline into this like cohesive game, to me is really, really impressive. And that's like, to me that kind of sets the standard for what I consider greatness. But that's another whole discussion for another time. But does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think with Jose Aldo, that's a completely different idea of improvement, because he's not, if you really think about it, he's the same guy, right? But he's added so many wrinkles that he's actually not the same guy anymore.
Yeah,
right?
It's almost like it's almost counterintuitive where it's like, it's the same approach, the same kind of like core competencies, but everything has been kind of augmented to such a level where it's like almost unrecognizable, right?
Right, and they're not like massive improvements, right? They're just small wrinkles that like his jab, his ability to kick the basing leg when his opponent kicks. It's like small things that have like improved his style to like a level that it's like impressive to us, but might not be impressive to somebody else.
Yeah,
because like when you think of Jose Aldo, you don't really think, oh, he's massively improved, right?
Yeah, no, you just go, that's Jose Aldo. That's But when you look at when you kind of bust out the microscope and look at his game in a more comprehensive sense, it's like one of the adjustments he's made later in his career is doing that little inside slip to lead hook to the body, stuff like that. All of those like in tight boxing combinations, a lot of that which was kind of absent earlier in his career, where he's just kind of throwing big shots, like big overhands and kind of running in. And you can say like, okay, that is a marked improvement. That's something that he's developed as like an additional layer to his game that didn't necessarily exist earlier in his career, right?
Right. Like, to riff off of that, stylistically, he's still the same. It's like I still think that like if he still faced off against Max Holloway today, the result would still be the same, because that inside slip that you're talking about, like he still does that big slip, like those big movements, like when he's standing still for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah, and everything is super explosive. His head movement is like, as fast as he can, and looking to counter back right away. So it's all, packaged in the same kind of framework of who he is as a fighter, but it's just these little incremental improvements to, what was already there, right?
Right, exactly. And like he would still have like stylistic problems with guys like Holloway, right?
Yep.
Based on that.
Yeah, and still have those same kind of issues with initiative that we discussed in episode 2, I think it was, where, he's able to get backed up and stuck to the cage, and rather than like, doing anything energy reliant to kind of get off the cage, he's comfortable saying, all right, I've got my whizzer, I've got wrist control, you can't do anything to me, I can't do anything to you, and then they just get stuck there. But I think that's, a little bit of off topic, because two improvements, there's a lot there, kind of beyond the surface level that I think we can touch upon. So like, when I'm looking at a fighter who people are saying is improving, I have to kind of verify that for myself. I have to go in and say like, all right, what are these, so-called improvements? What do they look like? And then try and really dial it in, bust out the microscope, look at everything in very fine detail and say, all right, the reactions that you would have had to this before are slightly different now. So rather than overextending, in the example of Jose Aldo, rather than like throwing your head all the way off the center line, hinging at your hips and whipping a big overhand, now you're just taking a little bit tighter of a slip, just making just enough distance. So rather than having it be this big energy reliant kind of expenditure, it's a little bit smaller, a little bit more efficient, and then going to the body, it can be a smarter option than just winging big at the head and throwing yourself out of position, right?
Right. And I think this ties into what I was talking about earlier, is that the topic of improvement is really nuanced, right? We have to look at all the context when when we're discussing improvement, which I don't think, like, a lot of commentators, a lot of people that have YouTube channels, they don't really dive into that context if you really think about it, right?
No, and again, that kind of goes back to like the surface level reasoning that we discussed in episode 4, was it? About
I
like
think, yeah,
bag
episode 4,
analysis.
yeah.
Because that's where you're seeing all the guys saying like, she's really improving her boxing, or that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think there's specific questions that you have to ask when you say somebody's improved. You can't just say somebody's improved. Like, is it? There's also the idea of the matchups. Like, were there actual improvements, or was it a good matchup stylistically? Did they actually add anything different? And if it was it applied well against a specific opponent? Like, how are they dealing with new positions that they've struggled before? And are they comfortable with them, or are they still struggling with those positions? Like, these are the things that we should be thinking about when talking improvement, right?
Yeah, and to the earlier point about kind of like that division that I created, of like, are you improving on things you're already good at? Are you improving things that you're not so good at? Another way that I look at that is, if you're looking at a matchup or looking at a fight that's already happened and you think someone has improved at something they're good at, what I like to look for is kind of the ease and efficiency of things. So, dissecting the matchup itself, see if it's like any issues that the opponent brings to the table that, I'm just able to make my game work really well against this, vulnerability, weakness, whatever it is that they have, or is it that I've actually like gone in and figured out new systems by which I can make these already existing things work better for me? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and a good example of like somebody that's worked out new systems but still using their own style would be Khabib. Like, Khabib's not somebody people would think of as somebody that's improved because he's always been the wrestler, right? But whether or not you thought he beat Gleison Tibau or not, he knew that was a bad performance, and he's added a whole system of slowing down the wall walk, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because that's and to that point as well, he's made leaps and bounds, or after that, he made leaps and bounds improvements in just that kind of pressure of his. Because a lot of his shots that he's shooting on Tibau, they're not the greatest shots. They were never the greatest shots, but they were usually enough to kind of get guys at least moving. And Tibau was more or less a brick wall, and he realized, okay, if that's not going to work, I need something that can work, and that's where you're seeing, those massive improvements in terms of like, actually getting guys moving backwards, actually improving, or essentially like reinventing the fence wrestling as we kind of know it now, right?
Right. And even though he's improved the fence wrestling, like you said, he's reinvented it, his shots are still bad. Or his shots were still bad. And he's still running at, like, even in his last fight against Justin Gaethje, he's still running at people.
Yeah, so I think that kind of speaks to like the degree of improvement within the framework of what a fighter's already existing skill set is. It's not like he was going back and saying, you know what, I need to figure out these new entries for myself. I need to, start working with false entries, half steps, stuff like that. He's just saying pretty much, all right, I need to figure out a way to kind of effectively bum rush people, for lack of a better term, and, then actually going in and, figuring that out for himself and creating that style that's so, like, ubiquitous with his name, right?
Right. And that's another thing, because he didn't, like, whether or not you thought, he just came off a bad performance. Whether or not he lost or not wasn't the like the changing point there, right? It was he knew his performance was bad. And that's why he needed to add those, like the rides, the chains along the fence. I think that's what's like really significant when you talk about Khabib, at least, right?
Yeah, because to kind of simplify things a little bit more, just to kind of like break things down to the most kind of core conceptual level, like the purpose of fighting, the way that we kind of look at good fighting versus just fighting is you're taking all of the steps, doing all of the things you need to absolutely load the odds in your favor, right? You're doing everything that you can to kind of disadvantage your opponent and maximize your own advantages. So I think, to play projectionalist for a second here. It's like, obviously Khabib probably did not feel super comfortable in that fight, just having, that degree of resistance from T-Bow. Went back, effectively to the drawing board and said, okay, how do I, make it so that guys can't really defend these things as well? How do I, if someone's getting double underhooks, how do I react from that instead of just getting stonewalled and having to step back and then try it all over again? And that's where you're seeing, like, all of the takedown chains coming together. That's where you're seeing all of the riding come together because, it's really hard to get anything going from those positions, especially, if you're working so hard to stuff a takedown and then all of a sudden he's in on a different takedown and your weight is going a completely different way, it's going to be a lot harder to kind of address that, right?
Right. And the good thing about Khabib is that he never had to, like, address his cagecraft either because he's in a division where I think somebody said this, like, in response to Jack Slack one time, but he's in a division where cagecraft is almost non-existent. Yeah. So I think that also helps that his style of, like, taking bad entries and forcing people to the fence actually helped him when he improved after T-Bow and adding all those new things. I think that actually helped him because of the fact that the division lacks so much cagecraft, right? So that's another context that we also have to look at, right?
Yeah, and that also kind of, that's prescriptive in and of itself. It's, the improvements that you need to make are only going to be relative to, the level of competition you're facing, right? Actually, I'm going to kind of retract some things that I've said previously, not actually, but the example that comes to mind immediately is Cyril Gane. Cyril Gane is a mess. He does a lot of things very, very wrong. He's, in my opinion, just not very good. But, to the efficacy argument, the improvements he needs to make really only need to be enough to, satisfy the needs of the division that he's in, which are pretty minimal compared to every other weight class, right?
Right. Cyril Gane, in terms of Cyril Gane, I mean, look at the top 15 of that division. I mean, Mick Parkin's there.
Yeah. I mean, it's really not all that much that you need to improve on, and the reason I think that he's shit is because he doesn't improve on any of them. He does not improve the things that he's bad at, he does not improve the things that he's supposedly good at. He just goes out and does the same thing he's always done, and sometimes it's enough, other times it's not, and that's not what I consider, like, elite level ability, right?
Right, and it's, like, at the point where, like, when he is facing, like, an overmatched opponent, it really doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, and it's just a showcase.
I think that's one of the problems with, like, we talked about stagnation. Like, I think that's one of the problems with him, right? Because, like, when he's facing an overmatched opponent, the stuff that he does, it's going to work no matter what, right? But when he's actually fighting somebody who's competent, that he's going to do the stuff that he does, and it's going to be horrible.
Yeah. And, I mean, we saw that against Volkov, who he had previously beaten, and does that speak to the improvement of Volkov? Maybe, maybe not, but it definitely speaks to the stagnation of Gane, and it's all a very approach-based thing, in my opinion. Like, there's no desire to actually improve, I don't think, right?
Right, and I think that goes on to, like, my next point, which is people think when commentators and YouTube channel and people with channels talk about improvement, they usually talk about it after a win, right? And I don't think that we should say somebody's improved after just 2 or 3 big wins, right?
Yeah, it has to be through, there needs to be analysis to kind of back up that claim. You have to have something to cite to say that they've improved. You can't just say, well, they beat so-and-so. I mean, they might have just beat that person by doing the same things they've always done. That doesn't mean that they've gotten better in any substantive way. It doesn't mean that they've actually, made any kind of improvement, right?
Right. And I think a good example of somebody that actually has improved after, like, a big loss would be Koji Horguchi. So, because Koji Horguchi, after the Demetrius Johnson loss, he went to ATT, learned how to wall walk, learned how to control the fence side space, and suddenly, like, his whole game has changed. Because if we looked at Kyoji's past fights before the Demetrius Johnson fight, he's dominating in the striking on the feet, right? And then suddenly he just gives up his back randomly, right? But then when he went to ATT, the wall walk completely changed his game.
Yeah.
So that's for me, that's adding something complete. That's adding something to his already, like, because he's already a talented guy. That's adding something to his game that has addressed a big issue that he's already had.
Yeah, so that's sort of shoring up the weaknesses while also creating, new opportunities, new systems by which to defend, and from there, opens up a whole new brand of offense, right?
Right, and he's gotten so good at it to the point where he can actually wall walk on ropes,
Yeah.
right?
And so, the inverse of that is a lot of people are saying, look how much this person has improved after a win, after 2 wins. But, more often than not, when you're winning, you don't feel the need to address some of these things, right? There are some guys who do. They're like Alexander Volkanovski, even Ilia Topuria to an extent. Like, guys can go out there and win and still say, all right, I need to get better at this. I mean, even Khabib with the T-Bow fight, like, he won the decision, but, little dodgy on that one. But, it's more so the losses that make guys feel the need to go back and address things. But there's another whole element there in that, you can look at a fight where a fighter loses and does a lot of really good work and actually come to the conclusion like, yeah, you know what? I can see improvements in that. It doesn't, the records don't actually indicate whether the improvements have been made or not, right?
Right. And I think that's another important point because even in losses, like you said, like even in the losses, like you can see somebody improve, right? Cory Sandhagen versus Umar, you would say that Cory's improved a lot with his wrestling and dealing with the back body lock, dealing with hooks when he's on the ground. You can say that he's improved there, but he didn't necessarily get the win, right?
Yeah, but that to me, it's that shouldn't necessarily matter in assessing a skill set, right? Like, obviously, doing the things that it takes to win fights is good, and that's a skill in and of itself. There are some guys who are just really great at kind of playing the rules and playing to the judges, right? But that just the results on paper don't dictate the actual skill sets, what has been done, what has been added to a fighter's skill set. So let me try and think of an example.
DJ versus Henry Cejudo too.
Yeah. I mean, for both guys, really, there's a lot to kind of look at there. And, obviously, Cejudo loses that first fight pretty quickly and pretty badly. But then you see he goes back and starts working on a lot of things going into... Did he only have the one fight with Wilson Hayes in between then?
Yeah. It was the only one fight with Wilson Hayes.
But think of, like, how wildly different his game was just in that fight alone, going to that kind of, karate Cejudo stance, whatever they called it, where he's just going and addressing a lot of these things that plagued him in the past in terms of, like, the distance management, the way that he's kind of approaching, the fight as a whole, approaching, the application of his wrestling, approaching the striking is more like a necessary phase rather than something that he would just rather try and get past, right? Because earlier in his career, Cejudo was not exactly a good striker or very, willing a striker. Like, he was throwing a lot more just kind of like 2-shot combinations and trying to get in or get out. And, it just wasn't the most cohesive game. There wasn't all that much process to it. And then you see he kind of goes back and figures out, all right, what skills do I have? What skills do I need to kind of, make my A game work, right? It's all in service of, that specific goal, right?
And I think, like, the biggest idea that he actually, like, built on was the idea of distance. Because before his game was just, or at least his striking was just Superman punches or, like, 1-2s, like, very rote stuff. And then suddenly he discovers karate, where he's standing out of borders, which is his turn, by the way, where he's waiting for the person to step in and he's drawing people to come into him, and then he's getting that open side counter. So I think with Cejudo, like improving from just like throwing this random combinations to using distance as his weapon, I think that's a good example of improvement, right?
Yeah. And then building on top of that, now he's added feints and a lot of different looks to his game. So, like, what used to just be like a guy who learned to strike from watching fights, essentially, just kind of doing what you interpret as, like, striking, right? Just throwing those, like, 1-2s, Superman punches, anything to just kind of, get in to this guy who actually has, like, a better understanding of some of the nuances to it, how to draw guys onto shots, how to... time entry, stuff like that, and how to pull things out of guys, right?
Right. And I think that's a example of a guy that's changed completely. Like not just what he got good at, not just like the guy that stays like he's getting good at his own style. He's changed to a completely different one if you really think about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would tell anyone, look at any of those earlier fights and then look at even his more recent fights while he's kind of athletically past it. Like, that's a completely different guy, right?
Right. And I think that goes into our next point is what is not improvement? Because like there's people that can go on like long win streaks and still look the same, but people will say that they've improved, right?
Yeah. And that's something that kind of annoys me a lot, and I'm sure probably has a similar effect on you. Let me think of an example.
Okay, I have a good one.
All right, go.
Okay, so Mackenzie Dern versus Rivas 2, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to shout out a story of the fight, Will. He showed me a sequence that happened in this fight specifically that he said was improvement, but I'm going to disagree with him because showing a good sequence in a fight, I don't think is an improvement, right? It's just one specific thing in that fight. So, like, what happened was Dern, like, fainted. She fainted, like, with a shoulder feint and drew out a counter hook from Rivas, and she ducked under that and picked up a single leg and drove her to the fence and then turned the corner to sit her down. And while I'll admit that is a good sequence, it's just that. It's just the sequence, right?
It's a moment in time.
It's not a cohesive thing that she was doing throughout the fight, right? It was just that one moment.
Yeah, it was more or less just like an opportunistic thing of like, oh, here's that. And, maybe you can make a point about how just the identification of that is some sense of improvement, right? Just in kind of like training those reflexes or whatever. But if it's not something that's consistently worked into, a larger overall game, it's not really, in my opinion, improvement. That's just, that's cool. That's great that happened, that you were able to do that. But, is it replicable? Can you do that again? Is that something that you've kind of like, fit into your game in a very specific way? Is that something that's like, part of your more robust skill set, the things that you can use frequently to win, right?
Yeah, and let's break that down a little bit even more. So he mentioned there's a lot of elements of skill there that in that sequence, like the feinting to draw out counters. In that fight, there was just that one feint, right? She wasn't feinting throughout the fight to make good reads throughout that fight to see if she can duck under like a right hand or to go under that hook again and grab the single. Like there's specific skills like within that sequence that are really good, but it's not being applied in a way that's cohesive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, built into this more kind of systematic thing. It's just, again, like it's a momentary observation and identification of an opportunity. And that, again, in and of itself, that is good. There's nothing wrong with, seeing opportunities and taking them. But it's not the same as creating those opportunities long term. It's not the same as like, had she been feinting from the start of the fight, engaging reactions and like drawing things out, that's a completely different thing than one singular moment in time, right?
Right. And like let's shift gears into like her single leg. It's still being done in open space, right? Like any good there's like two good wrestlers in the strawweight division, but any good wrestler knows that like when you get a single leg in open space, that's one of the easiest things to defend. And that sequence shows that she was doing that single in open space still. She just happened to drive Rivas to the fence.
Yeah. And another element of that is like, from a wrestling perspective, if you're going to be looking for an open space single, again, very easy to defend. So you're going to need a wide variety of finishes, right? And if you don't have that, you can't expect that to be like, a long-term, widely applicable form of offense.
Right, and like you said, like with Mackenzie Dern specifically, she doesn't do anything else after she reaches down for the single, right? It's just that. Like if she can't turn the corner, she can't turn the corner. She's just there.
Yeah, and then it's back to the
drawing board.
clinch.
Yeah, it's back to the drawing board. I think this is a good one to segue to and one of your favorite topics, Sean Strickland.
I was actually just about to bring him up as the perfect example of stagnation. a guy who has not really developed much of anything at all. You know, you can make a case that he's refined the things that he's always done, but that's not accurate. That's not true. Actually, I think that he's regressed a little bit, if we're being honest, because I've watched, this is how much I dislike Sean Strickland and his fans. I have gone back and rewatched his entire career just to say, no, you're an idiot. Because you look at some of his fights at welterweight, he's actually doing smarter things than he's ever really shown at middleweight, right? You know, he's feinting, he's, you know, backing guys up more efficiently. He's actually like getting on angles at some points. But all of the things that he uses at 185 are the same things that he's always used, you know. And there's absolutely no growth, and people will argue like, well, he beat Izzy, he beat Costa, he did that, you know. That speaks to the level of competition more than anything else. You know, if you're getting absolutely abused, battered by Kamaru Usman, getting knocked out by Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, for the same defensive limitations you've had your entire career, and they're still present at 185, and you're just not getting punished in the same way, that doesn't mean that you've improved. That means that the level of opposition you're facing has gotten worse.
Right, and I remember this because after he beat Adesanya, we saw people actually saying that he's improved, which, as you know, is really silly. Because, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
To these people who actually genuinely believe this, I would ask, what do you think he's improved on? Like, can you point out a single element of his game that's better now than it was before then? Or are you just going to cite, you know, the wins? Because that, you know, I think what we've at least covered in depth so far is that records don't mean shit in terms of improvement, right?
Right. And the thing that they will cite is the fact that he's getting better mechanically with his jab, which is not true whatsoever. Because, like, when you saw him fight Izzy and Dricus, he's still swatting away at punches, leaning back on one leg. He's still crossing his feet when he jabs at people, which you can see from, like, in the Izzy fight itself. Like, when he has Izzy backed up to the fence, like, he'll jab, he'll cross his feet, and then Izzy will, like, circle away. But the problem was he'll just walk back up to Izzy, and then Izzy will back himself up to the fence. But people actually cited that as something of improvement because of the win, right?
Yeah. And, you know, to the credit of people that don't really know that much, you will assume that, you know, wins are indicative of skill, right? You're going to assume that this guy is really good and this guy beat him, so that means this guy must be really good now, when that's not necessarily true. You know, there's a lot of different elements at play that kind of influence these things. But, you know, it requires a bit more. So you need to look at things beyond that kind of record reading, vibes level analysis, and actually look at the skills on display.
Right, like his jab, for example. Like, you say he's crossing his feet, but it's like not in the way that he's doing it. He's not doing it clever, right? Like, it's not in the way Dom Cruz does it, where he jabs in and then like he suddenly ducks out of range. But even though it's not mechanically the best, it's still a clever way of jabbing in. But he's still crossing his feet in front of his opponents after landing his jab. I think the reason why people are saying that it's an improvement is because he's actually landing it, right?
Yeah, and, you know, again, to their credit, I can see why someone might think that. You know, if you're not going to be the most dialed in on things, you're going to assume, all right, that's landing. It must be good. To the point of his defense, people will say he's such a defensive wizard. He's so tricky. All he does is just stick his arms out. That's it. You know, there's really not much head movement. He's trying to parry everything that's coming at him and just, you know, reaching his arms out and leaning back. That's not in any way an improvement of anything that was already there. That's not like the addition of any new secret skill set that the world's just not ready for yet. That's a genuinely bad defensive reaction. And the only reason it works is because the guys he's fighting aren't really good enough to punish it. You know, there's not really many guys in the middleweight division who are going to be feinting that out and then stepping in behind it. It's just a very reductive way of looking at things, I think.
Yeah, and to build on that, so like we say that there's not many guys at middleweight that can exploit it. I think it's also the fact that he's had success with that style, right? He's built a style where he can come in at sparring and people can't hit him, and he's able to use that style and he's comfortable with that style where he's at the point where he actually can't make adjustments when guys are able to exploit what he's doing, right? With when he's reaching back, when he's leaning back and then he's reaching for punches, or his hands go down when he gets a kick feinted at him. Like, these are things that are supposed to be exploitable, but he's at the point in his career where he's found a style that works really well for him in practice, that's worked really well for him in sparring, that when bullets start flying, it's a really tricky style to actually deal with, right?
Yeah, and you know, to the credit of it, it's like, it is tricky for guys to deal with just because pretty much all that guy seems to do is spar. So he has all of these hours of just kind of fine-tuning these things of like, you know, guy has probably seen just about anything that you're throwing at him. And, you know, to the credit of like when he just sticks his arms out, more often than not, that's, you know, just getting something in the way. That's keeping an elbow, a shoulder, whatever, in the way, in the path of where strikes are coming in at. And that in and of itself can be discouraging for guys of like, you know, I'm throwing everything I can and I'm just, you know, clattering off of bones instead of like getting anything meaningful. But that's not to say that it's this like, you know, actually elite level anything, really. It's just, you know, it's a very kind of basic game that he is tailored to, you know, the division that he's fighting in and kind of the level of opposition that he's facing. It's like, it works, that's good. That's good for him, but that doesn't mean that it's anything other than just, you know, something that works. It doesn't make it randomly high level just because, you know, it's having the desired effect of being tricky. It doesn't mean that it's like a complete reinvention of every known principle of fighting, right?
And I think that goes perfectly into the next question that I was going to ask was, do you think success can actually hinder improvement? Because he's had success with that style specifically against straight hitters, because his style is geared towards straight hitters and low kickers sometimes. But do you think that actually reinforces what he's doing?
Definitely. I mean, the way that I look at it is improvement is kind of like a convexity where it's, you know, there's a slope to it. There's, you know, a derivative of how much time and energy you're putting into actually like improving versus the yields that you're getting from that, the results that you're getting from that. Because, you know, to the point of like, if you're allocating a bunch of effort to improving something you're not that good at yet, that's then taking away time from, you know, the things that you already are good at. So it's like, you know, there's differing approaches to, you know, that kind of allocation of effort, of energy, and it all comes down to, you know, the same thing that I've mentioned a million times, opportunity cost. You know, every second you spend doing one thing is a second you can't spend doing something else. But so, you know, for a lot of these guys, it's kind of this like moral, ideological quandary of like, do I want to invest time in something that, you know, I'm not good at? Or do I want to keep doing the thing that I'm already good at that's already, you know, yielded me some results? So it's like, if you work yourself into a position like Sean Strickland where, you know, you're beating up a bunch of nobodies in the apex and moving up the ladder, why would you go and address things that you don't necessarily need to fix, but you would be a lot better for having fixed? Why not just keep doing the same thing you've been doing and, you know, hope it works out, right?
Right. And like, with that in mind, like, he's ingrained that he doesn't need to do that, right? Because he's ingrained it into himself, and he's beaten like top 10 guys in his division with that style, which is unfortunate because people should know better how to exploit it, but they haven't. So why would he change, right? There's no point, right?
There's absolutely no incentive.
Yeah, he's gonna beat up the guys in sparring, and he's gonna beat up the guys that throw straight punches at him.
Yeah, and you know, should it be this kind of thing where he has all of this motivation and drive to, you know, somehow work his way back to a title shot against Dricus, you know, to get a third fight, it's like, you know, you might beat everyone ranked like 5 through 10, right? Do enough to kind of cement that spot. But you're going to need to kind of, at this stage, you're going to need to kind of add something new to really justify that rematch, I think, right?
Right. And I don't, like, I'm being really pessimistic here. I don't think he will because, like we said earlier, he has success with this thing that he's that he's done before. So what's the point? Like, what's the point, right?
I think it's entirely justified to say that I don't think that's going to happen at all. Like, again, you know, it might be enough to beat all of the other, you know, ranked guys in the division, But if it's not actually, sustainable fundamental improvements, it's not going to, materialize into anything more. If you're sort of in this prison of your own design where you've gotten so good at this, weird, you-specific game, you're not going to necessarily deviate from that, even if you kind of know you need to,
And, credit to Sean, he does have good cardio, and he has a good eye for swatting at straight punches, and he's able to out volume these guys. But like you said earlier, it's the landscape of the division, right?
Yeah. And, that's why it's things that work at middleweight aren't working at welterweight. The same exact things in the same exact fighter, brought you to a world title at one weight class and, saw really no sustained success in another weight class. And so it's, that's why I say that the landscape of the division is kind of prescriptive of just how much room for growth guys necessarily need. It's just one of those things where it's I would like for all, for the bar to be raised across the board where every division gets better. Guys, kind of approach it holistically and say, how do I become, the best martial artist, the best fighter, the best athlete? But realistically, that's not going to happen until someone comes in who is really, really good and, kind of forces that growth on the division, right?
Right. And, we thought that was supposed to be Izzy, but, like we said before, there's problems with there's a lot of problems with his mechanics and with his footwork along the fence. So it really does, speak to the division itself, if you really think about it.
And, that's not to say that, just by being 185 pounds or, whatever, 203 or whatever this that guys are going to be cutting down from, just by being that size, you have to be bad, right? Because there was a time not that long ago where middleweight was actually, a much more kind of technically skilled division than it is now, right?
Right. Yeah. And, to shift gears a little bit, a good example of a guy that, really had, a specific style that was really working at lower levels and then had some success at a high level would be Justin Gaethje. WSOF Justin Gaethje, right?
Yeah, that little savage.
Yeah. So remember his early style was to take punches on the top of his head and then time low kicks when his opponent's weight would get to the front foot and then just melt them with just walking them down with pressure.
Yeah. And I mean, he literally was just destroying dudes' legs as well. And then, landing the big shots upstairs, catching the collar ties, landing, the big shots he needed to. But then it's moving up, getting to higher and higher level competition, that's not going to be working in quite the same way, right? Guys are a little bit better at, avoiding the leg kick, not throwing punches at the top of your head, moving, getting out of the way of things. It's so that's where you're kind of seeing, the need to progress, right?
Right. And you saw that with, let's first start with when he didn't progress. Cause when he fought Michael Johnson, who is better than his record states, he did the exact same thing to Michael Johnson, right? Even though he got hurt a bunch of times in that fight.
Went through hell for it. But, it worked. He was able to apply the existing skill set he had and get a win. And actually, in that, there's kind of a tie-in with your earlier question, that kind of suffering from success thing where, you don't need to grow in advance if you're still winning fights, right? And that's kind of, I think, where he might have been at that stage, because what happens right after that? He faces Eddie Alvarez and gets knocked out for the first time in his career, loses for the first time in his career, right?
Right, and the same thing with Poirier, right? Where his only idea was just to kick the legs.
Yeah, kick the legs and just try to throw big shots. Meanwhile, Poirier is throwing that straight left on every single low kick opportunity. That's a guy who kind of saw an opportunity, game plan for it, and had, the right mix of skills and abilities to capitalize on, this thing that this guy has been doing his whole career. But then think about what comes after that. When he fights Cowboy, James Vick, Edson Barboza, there are actual, clear and trackable improvements that you can see, right?
Right. After Dustin and the Eddie Alvarez fights, you can clearly see he's had a different approach. His stance is more upright. He's drawing stuff out, using the right hand to left hook. That's the thing. Do you think do you think he added those things, or do you think those are things he already knew how to do?
I think to a certain degree, they're things that he already knew how to do, but really like vastly improved on them to work them into, again, a cohesive game plan. Because you're seeing before that, it's really all just that big low kick, collar tie, uppercut, collar tie, overhand kind of thing, where it's just this very simplistic game. And then after those losses, he works on his footwork a lot, and also then develops this kind of like mid-range counterboxing ability as well as front foot pressure ability. And as he's getting better and better, ties those things into the things that he's already been good at, right? So that's when you're getting his jab. He develops the jab and then starts converting that into collar ties to get back to his like kind of A game, the things that he's always been, the best at. And I think that's where you can really start saying, all right, this is genuine, like, market improvement, right?
Right. And like to build off of that, because like we can actually say that that 3 fight stretch that he had, that was genuine improvement. But
Yeah.
after that, do you think after that it's like a little bit different, right? Like he's been at that same level. Like I think he's plateaued at some point. Would you
Yeah,
agree?
I would definitely agree with that. And, that's not to say that there's any, like, inherent wrong with that. It's not a negative thing. It's not a dig on Justin Gaethje, the athlete, Trevor Whitman, the coach, or anything like that. It's, there's only, again, so much time and energy you can invest in getting better at things before there's a point where you just kind of have to refine things. Like, you can't be constantly redlining trying to improve on every little thing, or everything that you already had will kind of fall apart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think it really showed like during the Oliveira fight. If you think about it, like his approach in the Oliveira fight was the same as it was in the Tony Ferguson fight, as it was in the Cowboy Oliveira fight. Like, not to say it was bad, it's just that it was figured out by that point, right?
Yeah, it's not going to work against that opponent necessarily either. Like, he was trying to, like, lean back from some of the shots, come in with, like, wild overhands, and then Oliveira's just catching double collar ties, landing a knee, as Gaethje's just trying to pull away and break away. He's landing that right hand that drops him real bad. And, again, there's never been that addressing of, like, the grappling issue for him either. So it's like, this is a guy who has developed to a certain ability, has worked to augment the things that he's already good at with a more kind of cohesive process, but hasn't really addressed any of the other things necessarily, right?
Right. And like even within his striking, there's still stuff there that needs to be addressed, right? Like his way upright stance that like because since he's so way upright and he does like these big dips, like it's really easy to read him and like get body shots like as Max Holloway and Carlos Oliveira did for like one sequence where like he does that big weave, like he'll start from an upright stance and then take a big dip and then come back upright. So like it's really easy to hit his body. And I think that leads into the next idea I was gonna ask you about was like Poirier 1 versus Poirier 2. There's a big gap of improvement there, but the improvement from the previous fight that he had is not the same from like Poirier 1 to Cowboy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it speaks to like a bit of, I'm not sure what the best way to put this is, but like, if it was this kind of exponential growth after the first Poirier loss, everything after that is very incremental if it exists at all, because the Gaethje that fought Poirier the second time was pretty much the same Gaethje that fought Oliveira, that fought, everyone else after that, I guess, that fought Ferguson, that fought, it's a lot of the same ideas and not necessarily implemented in any new or unique ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because like even if you look at the second Fiziev fight, it's still the same ideas. Like he's doing a good job of using his jab to grab collar ties, but like it's still the same like counter boxing, the same stand out at range with a high stance, like try to draw your opponent in. It's nothing that's like a drastic change like it was from like Poirier 1 to Donald Cerrone, right?
Yeah, and, I think you can make a case that perhaps he's trying to refine a lot of these things, make them a little bit more efficient, make them applicable under different scenarios, because obviously the finish to Poirier 2 was cool, throwing up a head kick, and it was like a good read that, every time Poirier's slipping, but at the same time, it's not like that's something that's necessarily worked into, the body of his game altogether, and it's not like it's something that he's really gone back to or addressed, to fit into, the greater game that he has. And, while it's good that the things that have always worked for you are still working for you, and maybe, you've made them work a little bit better, it's still kind of neglecting, the greater picture of everything else that exists, right?
Right. And I think, like, with his style specifically, it was really exploited in the Max Holloway fight, right? Because, like, Dustin didn't take that approach of, like, trying to draw out Justin's, like, a pawing out jab whenever he's out at range with that tall stance. And you can see Max, like, completely exploit that. But, like, Justin taking the same approach in Poirier 2, Poirier didn't exploit that same habit, right? He didn't try to make Justin hand fight and then hit the body multiple times, right?
Yeah. He just tried to do what worked the first time. And, it was working pretty decently for him as well,
Yeah.
Kind of speaks to a little bit of a stagnation on the part of both guys, I think. But, there is an inverse to improvement, is like sometimes you can work so much on one thing that what would have been there before isn't really there in the same way. And I think that's actually a good kind of little side note on Gaethje, is like he used to just be this, forward-moving, reckless kind of marauder, just coming forward, grabbing something, throwing leg kicks from the clinch, just doing anything to get guys backing up, getting to a place where he can get that connection that he really needed, versus in the Max fight where it's like this guy doesn't seem all that comfortable leading at all, right?
Right. He has to, or like Max is really like showing that Justin's he's really reliant on the opponent coming to him, right?
Yeah. So in that kind of development as like a counter boxer, he became more comfortable in like stepping back, taking the back foot, letting guys come to him so he can find those big counter shots. And the big improvement in his game is like the way that he can sometimes meld those two together. Like I think we saw, bits and pieces of that against Fizzy of the second time. But overall, it's this kind of like, to the point of opportunity cost, you've kind of drawn from the well of what was already there to kind of fill up the bucket of what you're trying to add. So now, like, that kind of, forward-moving pressure game isn't really as accessible to him as it used to be. And, there's a part of that has to do with athleticism, with durability, that kind of stuff. But, there's opportunities there to have improved that aspect of his game, without necessarily losing the ability to add new things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that goes perfectly into the next question, which is like, what do you think are some limiting factors to improvement?
I mean, there's a lot. It's going to be pretty situational, I think, but obviously, again, time is really going to be the biggest for guys. Like, if you don't have the time to really put into working on things that need to be addressed in some way, or, even things that don't need to be addressed, but by addressing them would make you a better fighter overall, you can't really justify that kind of investment in time. If you don't, like, if you're subtracting from the time you have to actually work on the things that you're already good at, it doesn't necessarily make sense to kind of, start from scratch and address things that you're not as good at. Because after all, it is like a profession for these guys. This is their livelihood. You need to kind of maximize the things that you need to win rather than like just to be good, right? Another is just, the sport itself is very demanding. It requires a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of, your actual like physical body. It takes its toll on guys. It's high in injury risk, and that's something that is going to eat up time, is going to eat up, resources that you kind of can't afford to lose either, right?
Right. In addition to time, I think coaches is really important, and I think that's one of the limiting factors of improvement, because if you don't have the right coaches, or you don't have the resources to seek out the right coaches, because not everybody's going to have resources to find coaches that they know are good at specific things, I think that's also what's going to limit you. Because as much as we talk about self-improvement in these fighters, the thing that really is going to bring them to a different level is somebody that's looking from the outside, right? Like coaches that have experience in building up fighters and like adding stuff to other fighters' games are going to be like a benefit to the fighters improving. But some people, they stay with the same coach for their entire life, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of like the sport's biggest limiters overall is that there is almost this sort of archaic idea of loyalty that doesn't necessarily exist in other sports where guys go, this is my coach, I'm sticking with him no matter what, even if it's Lloyd Irvin and he's done all the shit that Lloyd Irvin's done. There's this kind of like tribalism in the sport of MMA that doesn't necessarily exist in the same way in other sports in the gym culture, not just in like the wider fan culture. But I think, there's an element there of just kind of the resource scarcity in MMA, because the entire ecosystem of the space is almost designed to not have, the best level athletes that it could have. The training infrastructure is a little bit underdeveloped, we'll say, like, wide scale, at the scope at which the sport is developing especially, as well as, obviously the financial elements. Like, think about, to your point about coaches, what is kind of the textbook example of, a guy who saw the needs that he had, address them by getting the best coaches possible. It was George St. Pierre when he had that, like, sort of the all-star lineup of coaches with, Freddie Roach, Faraz, John Danaher, whoever else, that picture of his corner. It's like, that's a guy who could only really do that because he had already sustained such a high level of success, because he had the financial resources to, afford to fly those guys out to him or fly himself out to them, right?
Right. And the thing that's weird about MMA is that, like, say you did have an unlimited amount of resources, you actually can, like, go to different gyms and train with, like, different fighters, different coaches. That's the difference between that and like a team sport like basketball, where you're stuck with what you're stuck with, right?
Yeah.
You're stuck with what management has given you.
Yeah. The facilities are what they are. You don't have much say in the matter, right?
Right. But even though like you said, there's like an ecosystem where it doesn't like facilitate improvement in MMA, I actually think that it actually can if you're more creative about, or if you're more open to going to different coaches, right? Because like we've talked about this before, but like in basketball or in football, it's easy to improve because you have good facilities like an organized training program, and it's dictated by upper level management, which you don't really see in MMA, right?
Yeah, because again, it's, I think it kind of all folds into the umbrella of, where the money comes from in the sport. For most guys, the goal is to get to the UFC, the singular promotion that has the majority of the fans. So, there's a lack of, like, market competition that kind of trickles down in that, you're going to have less access to money, to resources, than if there were a bunch of different organizations all clamoring for high-level athletes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and, like, another example of somebody like getting a lot of resources, and I'll let you talk about this one since I'm completely biased on this, would be like Zhang Weili.
Yeah.
Well, let me start with saying, like, she's like ever since her first loss to Rose, like, she's gone out to find different coaches, tried to find like good scouting, tried to find everything that she can add to her game to prepare for specific opponents.
Yeah. And a part of that speaks to just kind of like the mental constitution of the athlete themselves. Is this someone that genuinely wants to improve, not just for the sake of like appeasing a narrative, but like to genuinely make improvements? And also just, that sort of like confidence and comfort to go out of your way to kind of find these factors, to go and find these different gyms, to find these different scouts, to find all of these different tools that you need to, incorporate into, yourself, your training, to actually sustain that improvement. And you can see it pretty clearly, because like, look at Weili's early career in the UFC. very much just kind of like an outside kickboxer a little bit with like a few tools that worked pretty well, that were replicable against a wide variety of opponents, but not the kind of like dialed in and focused game plan based approach. It's very much just like this is what brought me here. How do I keep making this work until it comes to a point of I'm getting controlled on the ground by perhaps not the greatest grapplers. How do I go and make those improvements? And that's when, you're bringing in Josh Hinger and you're also working on the wrestling to a very high level to become like a genuinely very skilled offensive and defensive wrestler. And all the while improving, the striking to a point of like, you're not going to be going out there like Canelo or whoever, but you have, enough confidence in the tools that you have and in the approach that you're taking to each individual fight that you don't need to be, right?
Right. And do you think that because she is the champion, and even though the champion salary is not that big, even though she is the champion, and do you think that the fact that she has these resources allows her to get these coaches that she wouldn't necessarily have gone like earlier in her career?
I mean, it definitely doesn't hurt. I think it would be feasible for like, just an unranked UFC fighter to go to some other gym where they've identified that they're really good at this thing that I need to address. But I think, there's a little less barriers for entry for, a world champion, stuff like that, because, part of it is just related to, the perception. If you're viewed as like someone who's really, really good, really, really talented, coaches are going to be a little bit more inclined to work with you than they are with like Sean Bannon, coming in and saying, I really need to work on my jiu-jitsu. Can you guys help me? They'll say, I mean, yeah, sure. But you're not going to be getting that same degree of like attention, I don't think, because, it doesn't stand off the paper as this kind of like golden opportunity, so to speak, right? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to like address this idea of limiting factors, right? Your standing in the sport will actually affect how you're viewed by certain coaches.
Yeah. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that either. Like, if I'm a coach and a world champion says, hey, can you help me with this? Yeah, I'm jumping on that opportunity much more so than like, say I've got a 3 o'clock time slot open and Islam Makhachev says, hey, can you help me with this? And Paddy Pimblett says, hey, can you help me with this? And the only time I've got open is 3 o'clock. You bet your ass I'm choosing the guy who has, a lot higher ceiling and a lot more achievements, right?
Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable too, because even when you do help them, like your name gets out there too, right?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it is business, and even just on a personal sense, like you want to work with the best possible athletes that you can, right?
Right. Yeah. So like, see, that I think there's a weird balance there, because like when these people do get to the highest level, like an Islam, a Weili, like Robert Whittaker, like where is there like, do you think they have limits to their improvements? Because they're already at a high level that we talked about this with Justin Gaethje. Like, can they add like more things, like more drastic things, or is it just refinement at that point? Or is it different for each person?
I mean, I think there's definitely a difference in each individual. Some people have, a much greater ability to learn, process, absorb, and apply new information than others do. But at the same time, I think there's like, there's only so much growth potential in each individual. Like you can't become like a master of one specific style and then all of a sudden one day say, all right, I'm going to go all the way back to square one and start over and master a whole new style. It's just, the human body, the human brain, and, just the confines of like time and space and resource allocation aren't designed to really facilitate that or make that even like feasible or possible, right? I think there's a tremendous amount of growth and guys can make like even just little incremental improvements that can, benefit them greatly in fights. But I don't think that it's like you can completely reinvent yourself, right?
Right. I think this is something Sean Madden talked about on an Instagram post. He talked about improvements within camp versus out of camp, right? And I think that when you do reach that high level, I think I do agree with you. Like it's more incremental improvements or small improvements, and you do that like off camp, like when you don't have a fight scheduled.
Yeah, when the pressure isn't on and when you don't necessarily need to, dial things into like this most kind of intense level, if that makes sense.
Right. And then when you're in camp, then you're training for a specific opponent, and then those things that you've worked in off of camp should build into the stuff that you're specifically working for that opponent, right?
Yeah, that's one thing that I think we haven't really touched upon yet. Like, improvements that guys are trying to make should have feasible fit-ins in their overall game. Like, it can't be, I'm trying to think of an example, but it's a little bit nebulous a concept, but like, you can't have something that's just completely incongruent with everything that you're already good at, work really hard at it, and then try to incorporate it into your game. If it's like not directly applicable to the way that you fight to the things that you do, it's not really worth the time or effort, and it's not something that you can necessarily expect to like pay off for you, right?
Right, and I think I have two good examples about that. So like Koji Horguchi and Henry Cejudo, there are two guys that work at Borders, right? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want them playing the double jab game, like pressuring people and putting people to the fence, like with like a heavy like double jab and like boxing game, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't do that because they're best at like meeting people, like playing Borders and then meeting people at the middle. Like those are two completely different things that you wouldn't do in the off season, right?
Yeah, it just makes no sense, and it's like, again, that's sort of like the point of diminishing returns, where you're wasting this energy and effort on something that is not going to have any return on investment, right?
Right, and like with them specifically, I think a good thing to add for them would be like single shot strikes from out of range, right? Like kicks, like low kicks from Borders, high kicks from Borders, your feinting game. That's the type of stuff that you would add for them specifically, but you wouldn't necessarily add like a high volume pressure game with them, yeah. Right?
Exactly. Just, similarly to like if you have a guy like Poirier who is really good on the front foot, really good pressure fighter, you wouldn't all of a sudden say like, all right, you're going to be, a back foot counter striker now. Like it's just not, necessarily the greatest way to advantage their, physical attributes, their existing skill set, or, their win conditions, so to speak, right?
Right. And do you think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to improve? Because you have to strike that balance, per se, right?
Yeah, and in fairness, that's a really hard thing to do. Like, balance is incredibly hard to find in real life when you're out there training, 2, 3 times a day, 4 or 5 days a week. Like, it's really hard to try and figure out, just exactly how much energy you can kind of invest into any specific thing. It's like, are there things that you could improve on? Yes, but there's going to be a lot more things that you can potentially improve on than things that, will necessarily benefit you in any immediacy, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that makes it hard to improve on is that, like, I think some of the things that people don't like look at is practice, right? Or their training, like, right? Everybody like focuses on film work and like watching their opponents. You rarely see people. Well, I know one person that does this, but you rarely see people that that film their training footage. And I think that could be a limiting factor in why people don't improve, because you're looking at your own specific habits, right? And some people don't do that. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's like, everyone has their own individual strengths and weaknesses, right? That's natural. That's like, 101 stuff. But to be able to identify those, that's the first step in like creating the opportunity for growth, right? You need to understand this is a weakness. This is something, even in your strengths, there's going to be some degree of vulnerability of like, something that can be taken advantage of. And to kind of start shoring those up, you need to first recognize that there is this opportunity there, right?
Right. And that idea of like defeating yourself, because that's something that no fighter ever talks about, right? They always talk about beating their opponent. They never talk about defeating themselves, which means that you look at what you're weak at and then you try to build off of that, right? And that's why I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to improve is because most of these fighters are worried about they're just worried about beating the person in front of them instead of beating the person that's them and trying to beat the person in front of them, right? if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in fairness, I would say that like a lot of that kind of identification and diagnoses issue is on the part of the coaches. That's like something that they should be addressing more so than the fighter going, oh yeah, I suck at this, because as I think we've spoken about before, like the kind of fanatical self-belief that it takes to be a professional fighter is like antithetical to that idea of, oh, you know what, maybe that's something that's exploitable. Like you kind of have to believe that you're the best at everything that you do. So it's in my opinion, the impetus is more on the coaches to say, if you're throwing a jab, just rotate the shoulder in, right? Like those kinds of little things that require adjustment. I think, to your point, like the self-defeating things need to be addressed by like the coaches. Then in and of itself requires a more, refined kind of training ecosystem, because that doesn't necessarily exist in every gym, right?
Right, and not just the coaches, the scouts too, because one of the things that I think the thing that will take like scouting to the next level is that you scout, like if you have a fighter that scouts to beat themselves first before beating the opponent, because once they know how the opponent's going to approach them based on what their supposed like exploitable habits are, I think that gives them like a huge advantage, which I think that's another reason, because like you mentioned this before, that when you're a fighter, you need to have like this delusion that you're unbeatable, right?
Yeah.
But
it's a qualifying characteristic, in my opinion.
Right, but I think the limiting factor to that is that if you think you're unbeatable and you don't believe you have these weaknesses, then you don't know how your opponent's going to approach you, right?
Yeah.
It's that art of war saying, right? The know yourself, know thyself, know your opponent, and then 1,000 battles you'll win, right?
Yeah, something like that. That sounds right.
Yeah, something like that, right? But yeah.
No, I think that's actually a really interesting idea, and especially something that could, then elucidate all of those kind of growth opportunities, all of those rooms for improvement, so to speak. Like, I think that's sort of, to your point, like the future of where things should go. Should the sport trend in any kind of upward direction? That seems like it's not doing that at present.
Right, but right now the sport isn't, or right now most fighters, what they do is they just do what they're good at, right? And when they do try to add something, they can't do it because when the bullets start flying, they just revert back to what they're good at, like what we said earlier.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a lot of nuance that kind of needs to be applied to these things. Like you can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to improve my boxing," and then all of a sudden have really good boxing. Whatever that might be. It's very specialized, nuanced kind of applications of a variety of different things, and that requires like, just the physical ability, the mental acuity, and, just overall the environment itself that's conducive to that kind of growth. And that also, to the earlier point, that requires like, the kind of top-down approach of like, if you are the champion, you're going to have a lot more opportunities. You're going to have, not necessarily a lot more opportunities, but you're going to have, an easier time accessing those opportunities than you might in another position. So I think it's like, to get real long-term sustainable growth, the planets kind of have to align a little bit for you. So it's not like it's something that's like everyone can just do, right? Because if they could, why wouldn't they?
Right, and I think, like you said, you have to have like that. It's unfortunate, but you do have to have like that championship pedigree. But I think another reason why it's hard to improve is most of these fighters aren't willing to fail in the training room. And one of the ways to improve is to fail, know why you failed, and then try to apply that failure, or try to talk about that failure with other people, and then try to figure out how to address that, and then use the thing that worked on you against other people.
Exactly.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. To kind of elaborate, it's like, I don't think we're saying you need to be a world champion to be able to improve, because that makes no goddamn sense. How would you get to that point to begin with? No one's born, an elite level fighter. But, it's a lot easier to make those little incremental improvements, the more kind of accessibility you have to different things. But to your point, like the main motivator, the main aggregate of growth, of improvement is going to be losing. It's going to be failure. It's going to be, those moments where you recognize something needs to be done because what just happened wasn't it. It didn't work, right? And I think that's why, like, you know, you'll see a lot. So in like a grappling context, this is going to be a very niche specific like look, but in a grappling context, in a jiu-jitsu gym, you'll see guys who are wrestlers grow a lot faster than just, you know, your average jiu-jitsu hobbyist because there's a lot more willingness to expose themselves to risk. There's a lot more willingness to expose themselves to bad positions to try to implement things that you've just learned. Whereas, you know, your typical kind of hobbyist grappler is going to be someone who's only working their A game in training because they don't want to lose these training rounds, right?
Right, and like to build off of that, like when you see wrestlers in like a jiu-jitsu context, like they are often put in bad positions, so they know what it's like to fail. They fail almost every day.
Yeah, because
and they're willing. And they're
yeah, and I think that's a completely separate conversation, but like that's a bit of a distinction between like, you know, the athlete and like the, you know, hobbyist, whatever. But that's neither here nor there. But I think, you know, to tie it back in, there needs to be less stigma to losing, right? Part of that comes from like the fans, but obviously the fans aren't going to be privy to what's going on in training rooms, but just that overall kind of culture of MMA where it's like, you know, losing a round in training isn't the end of the world. It's an opportunity to, you know, do something better the next time. Unless you're getting like brutally knocked out or tearing your ACL or something, that should be seen as room for improvement, as like an opportunity for progress and growth, rather than like, oh man, I guess I just suck, that kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, and often when people do lose, they see it as a form of decline, which ties into our last point, which is how do we actually gauge decline? And now this is something like I'm actually really interested in because I'm not really good at gauging somebody's decline. I'm more of like trying to defeat somebody's A game more than anything else.
Yeah. So it's one of the big things that you'll see in like any MMA space is people don't necessarily know what to look for when they're seeing someone on the decline, because, you know, you can see when someone just falls off a cliff athletically, or, you know, when someone's chin goes, something like that. Those are readily apparent, but there's usually a lot of little signs before then that someone's, you know, on the back nine of their career. So one of the things that I like to look for, you know, again, it all requires context, right? You need to understand what this guy is good at, what they've been good at, you know, what they've just kind of looked like historically, to see when those things are starting to change a little bit. So like for me, the number one thing is looking, you know, at someone's eyes. So if it looks like somebody's eyes are going, that's the first thing. You know, it's eyes, reaction, defensive awareness, stuff like that. So if you have someone who you can always kind of tell when they see a shot coming, and all of a sudden like that reaction seems a little bit slowed, you know, if they're, you know, just not seeing it coming altogether, that's usually the first sign that like, okay, the wheels are falling off a little bit, right?
Right. So would an example of this be like somebody like Kamaru Usman post Leon 2?
Yeah, there's a big part of that, as well as just like the much steeper physical decline of just like his knees going, his, you know, all of the accumulated injuries over his career, because that's another whole piece of it. Like, obviously these guys are going through injuries, surgeries, yada yada, and you can see guys just getting slower over the course of their career, less dynamic in their explosions, in their movements, in a lot of these things that they were good at. So one thing to kind of like keep track of as you're watching somebody's career is like, you know, it's a little bit harder to gauge speed in real time, you know, because there's always going to be issues with like the frame rate of the cameras and whatnot. But like sometimes it's just really, really obvious. Sometimes it's a little bit more nuanced, but you can generally tell, you know, when guys are declining in that sense as well, which again requires context, requires like a certain degree of analysis of the skill set that exists. And another thing to look at is just like, again, it ties in with the eyes. It's just like that sense of distance and range. Like that's one of those things that can erode very quickly for guys sometimes, and it just seems to come out of nowhere. But you can kind of see it, you can track it as it's developing. Like, you know, I'm trying to think of a specific example. I mean, Tony Ferguson might be the most exaggerated example. You know, a guy who, you know, the strength, the height of his career was like really good at managing distance, you know, had a really good eye for like, you know, just slotting elbows in, stuff like that. And, you know, obviously like rolling with punches. So as that starts to go, you see it goes entirely. Like now all of a sudden, you know, he can't stay at his desired distance. He's just kind of crashing into guys. The guys are crashing into him. He can't do the things he needs to do to avoid that. Even, you know, as far back as the Anthony Pettis fight, you can see a lot of those things developing. You can see, you know, he's not seeing the punches coming nearly as well, not rolling with them as well as he would have just a few fights ago, as well as like the distance thing. He's there, you know, what made that fight so kind of chaotic and exciting, more so than like, you know, Tony Ferguson's entire career, is that there's this element of, you know, he can't necessarily control the distance in quite the same way because he can't gauge it in quite the same way, if that makes sense.
Right. And we talk about like gauging distance and like this physical decline that we see in fighters. What about fighters that you like, we can't really tell if they have, but they've lost a couple of times, and there's this idea like when you look at their performance, you think they've declined. Like an example that comes to mind is Alexander Volkanovski. Because like in the Ilya Topuria fight, I know some people that said that his footwork looked awful and he looked slow, but I disagree with that because his footwork actually looked pretty good in that fight, and like some of the habits that he's always had just got exposed.
Yeah.
So like, what do you think about that one?
I mean, I think that's actually a pretty interesting wrinkle because I'm in the same camp as you. I think Volkanovski looked skill for skill just about where he's been historically. You know, I do think he's slowed down a little bit even since the Korean Zombie fight. Like you can see there's a small bit of decline, but, you know, I don't think it's necessarily as exaggerated as people are claiming because the first Islam fight, he looked really, really good. Second Islam fight, obviously, there's the context, short notice, aging, and also just, you know, that shot's going to put just about anyone out, I think. And, you know, to your point, the Topuria fight, you know, he looked, in my opinion, pretty good. And the same kind of weaknesses he's always had just reared their ugly head. But I think there's an interesting note in there about, like, I don't want to call it the mental decline, but just, like, I guess we can call it, like, the stress effect, I guess. You know, riding off of a brutal loss. You know, I think situations like that can kind of accentuate the same historical weaknesses that guys have had, make them more prone to doing some things that might not be the best in those moments. And that can kind of be like a ball rolling downhill where, you know, you make one slight mistake when you really shouldn't. And now all of a sudden, like, you're going into the next fight with all this pressure of don't do that, yada, yada. And, you know, they always say, like, you know, you need a short memory in fighting. Like, you can't think about the results of your last fight. You just need to be focusing on, you know, the task at hand. But it's a lot easier said than done, right?
Right, because I think the Volkanovski is an interesting, like, from Ilya Topuria, the Ilya Topuria fight for Volkanovski, I think that's an interesting one just because, like when we look at that, like, when we go through it with a fine-tooth comb, like, it's really, like, you can see his ideas are still there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would argue, like, there was one thing that I really didn't like about the performance from him, and that was just his kind of insistent on that step-up middle kick. I thought that was, like, maybe not the best idea against a guy who's looking to kind of step in on you, which I think maybe kind of speaks to that, like, you know, pressure cooker thing in terms of, like, the decline that stress can have on, you know, actual performance and stuff like that. You know, athletically, he looked about on par with where he was, you know, not all that long ago. Like, obviously, bit of a slow sloping decline because has slowed down a little bit. The eyes seem to be affected just a little bit. But the big thing for him, I think, is really just the durability. You know, as you get older, like, you can't nearly take a shot as well as you could. And he never had, like, an iron chin or something like that, but just was able to, you know, be better than guys, be faster than guys, and just fight to a really, you know, advantageous game plan more often than not. So I think, you know, all of these issues kind of get exaggerated a little bit, you know, as time goes on, if that makes sense. And, like, they compound together.
Yeah, and in that fight specifically, too, like, I saw that he was, like, doing really good stuff when he was strafing to Topuria's power side, where he's constantly, like, reaching out for for that rear hand of Topuria, so Topuria can't just like freely throw his right straight.
Yeah.
And same thing when like he's like even his stance switches weren't bad. Like he'd land an inside low kick and then he'd stance switch and then like angle out.
Yeah.
So like I didn't think that he looked like his footwork was bad in that, or that he looked slow. It's just that like the ideas that were exploited, or like his habits of like leaning back after exchanges or leaning back after stance switches, that kind of caught him at that fight specifically, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of people just want to say that he was more washed than he is as a means of kind of discrediting the win for Topuria, which I don't think that's the case. I thought that was just a very smart performance from Ilya and a really good way to take advantage of the things that Volk has always kind of shown weaknesses in. At the same time, I think it was a good showing from Volk in some regards, just not in others. But that's not to say that, like, he's completely washed or he fought really stupidly. Like, I thought he was doing a lot of really good things. There were just some things that, like, obviously, in hindsight, you could say maybe do that differently, or, like, even in the moment, you can say, like, okay, I don't love that look. But that's not to say that, like, he beat up an old man, right?
Right. And, like, I think, like, a clear decline would be, like, somebody like Henry Cejudo, right?
Yeah.
Like, somebody like who's fighting against, like, somebody like Song Yadong, who, like, that he, like, Henry's, like, really good strategically wise, and, like, he should, like, with his original style, I don't think he should have had any trouble with Song Yadong, right?
Well, and that's just, that's the big athletic decline. You see he's slower than he's really ever been. He's, not necessarily seeing a lot of the shots coming, and obviously there's a bit of a pun with that fight because of the eye poke and everything, but
yeah.
Just that kind of defensive awareness, defensive, like, minded responsibility, I guess, is like, it's just not activated in the same way because you're not necessarily seeing the shots coming. You're not seeing, a lot of the things that you would have when you were, in your prime, right?
Right. And somebody that I've seen arguments about decline is Jose Aldo, right? Because, like, everybody knows that, or some people disagree about this, but Jose Aldo has definitely physically declined. Technically, he's upped his game by a lot that most people don't see, but he's physically declined. Right?
Yeah, he's old.
Yeah, but like that. See, would you see that? That's the thing that's hard about this, is because, like, he's added, like, so many wrinkles, but he's also on, like, a physical downward spiral in his career, right?
Exactly. So that's, actually, in my opinion, that's what kind of makes for, like, a bit more, in my opinion, like, what I would give a little bit more credit to as, like, an elite level fighter is, like, to kind of do all those technical things to round out your game in such a way to kind of try and offset the physical decline. I find that insanely impressive. But, at the same time, it's very much still, like, declining. Like, athletically is just not where he used to be, despite being, a little bit more well-rounded technically and, like, doing a lot of really good strategic things to compensate for that athleticism decline and all that. So it's like, it's not this binary thing where, like, you're either in your prime and on the way up or getting better or whatever, or you're on the decline and you're just getting worse and worse. It's like, these are really just, like, observations about kind of athleticism, physicality, durability, stuff like that. It's not that, like, you can't still win fights while you're on the decline, right? It's just that, over time, the wheels are going to have to fall off at some point. Like, this is not a sport that's conducive to long, healthy careers, right?
Right, and I think that's what makes this, like, conversation so nuanced, is that there's so many different contexts that we have to look at in terms of the fighter itself and in terms of the matchups that they're given. It's really hard to actually gauge improvement if you really think about it, right?
Yeah, because there's a million different lenses to look at it through.
Yeah, there's some people that you see, like, there's massive changes to their game, massive, like, improvement from fight to fight, but like you said, like, at some point the wheels are gonna fall off.
Yeah, it's unavoidable, right?
They can compensate with adding more technical stuff to it, like with Jose Aldo, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would even argue Max Holloway to a lesser extent, like, as a guy who's on the decline and, not seeing the shots coming as well, not nearly as fast as he was, but they're still adding different wrinkles to his game to try and compensate for that, right?
Yeah, so if we were to wrap this all up, it's not just because you go I'll give a funny example that's gotten me in trouble by many people in the WMMA community, which is Carla Esparza. After she went on a 6-fight winning streak where she pretty much did the exact same thing she's been doing since the Invicta days. But does that mean that she's improved? No. She's still doing the nonsense where whenever she gets feinted, she'll shift to the opposite stance with no protection whatsoever, or she'll still do that weird head outside single whenever she's pressured to the fence. Yeah, she had that good performance against Yan Xiaonan, but that was more Yan Xiaonan being an idiot, trying to armbar herself, right? Actually, MMA Underrated said this. I think he said this beautifully. Carla Esparza, she's actually she is the peak of what an MMA fighter shouldn't be, because she's never added anything, and she's never added anything to her game of any significance, and she succeeded because her opponents made the worst tactical approaches against her.
Yeah, just because the bar was kind of so low for a lot of those opponents, right?
Right. So that is the perfect example of what you shouldn't be in MMA, right? Because she succeeded in spite of not adding anything. She's never still the stuff that, because I had to sit down, so I can say this because I sat down and watched every single one of her fights from Invicta all the way up to Rose 2. And I can tell you that was not a fun thing to do.
No.
And in every single one of those fights, she's done the exact same thing. But there's people in the media, especially in 2021, that said she deserved a title shot because she's improved, quote unquote, right? Yes, and that's the thing that really pisses me off about her, is because that people should not. That is an example of somebody that's never improved throughout their entire career, but had success because of bad tactical decisions her last 6 opponents made. I don't know if you agree.
It's just that front-loaded growth of, her transition from wrestler to MMA fighter, and then everything else was really just moving along kind of the same path. Everything was already put in place skills-wise, and there was really no significant effort to improve things from there. I mean, think of it remember the Joanna fight?
Yeah.
Brought absolutely nothing new to the table than any other fight. The second Rose fight, the worst fight of all time, is just because she hadn't made any kind of improvements. Whereas, Rose had made a bunch of improvements, but didn't do anything to address, the opposition coming back at her. It wasn't a very tailored kind of approach. So it's just, it's kind of, I would equate it to running on fumes as a career. You filled the tank up all those years ago when you first started developing as an MMA fighter, and then just didn't address it after that. You just went, yeah, we're good. Going to keep this thing rolling for however many years until it can't anymore, right?
Right, and here's another thing that's really bad about Carla Esparza. When she lost to Tatiana Suarez and when she lost to Joanna, there was no sense of in her next fight, there was no sense of what is she doing differently, right?
Yeah.
Does she have a different approach? Is she added anything to her striking to make her wrestling more effective? Can she stop the wall walk, which, as we know, she can't? Is she putting herself in a crucifix after going for a single like she did against Randa Marcos, right? Which that cost her in her second title reign.
Yeah.
So that's an example of stagnation, and I think another part of it has to do with her coaching, like we said earlier. Because after the Weili fight, I don't think you've ever seen this, but there's the Thrill and Agony series. If you look at the 281 Thrill and Agony in the locker room after Weili just finished Carla, you can see her coach telling her, you can beat this girl next time, and you're like,
based on what?
Yeah, based on what? You got reversed, you got put in the crucifix twice, and you got beat up along the fence. It's reinforcing bad habits and not improving within fight to fight. Even though people in the MMA community with shitty YouTube channels want to glaze her.
Yeah, because people want to equate a winning streak with, substantive improvements when they don't necessarily exist. And that's, I think, that's the whole issue encapsulated of, false improvements, as well as just that, the whole larger scale discussion of like the sports ecosystem where coaches are all too happy to say, you did great, champ, when you just got your ass kicked. Because you've done the same things your entire career that are incredibly exploitable, right?
Right, and that's the biggest problem with that's the biggest problem when people just use that word improvement, right? It's just like as they say, a cop out, right?
Yeah, it's just a buzzword, a space holder. It's not necessarily true, and like that's the thing is you can go and watch fights and watch an athlete's career in context, and you can track the improvements in real time, like if they're actually being made.
Right, and you really got to think, and you got to think about it within each matchup too, right? If you really like go through an athlete's like career and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we've covered just about everything in some pretty serious depth here because we're sitting at about over almost 2 hours ish now.
Nice.
So yeah, so I think we will call it.
We'll call it a day.
Do you have anything to plug?
Nope. Nothing to plug.
Me neither, except for this. So, if you're listening to this, good work. It works.
Cagecraft Podcast, you guys should definitely listen to the Cagecraft Podcast.
Yeah, I heard they're really handsome. But with that, thank you, my man. This was great. And, appreciate your time, dude. Peace.